A forgotten prophecy warns that 2025 will be humanity's ultimate turning point, and American psychic claims China will triumph in a global war. A man claiming to be from 2062 offers a chilling warning: get to the mountains. A thousand-year-old poem speaks of plague in a world converging at the center in the year of the snake 2025. And then there's Vanga, Nostradamus, Aramir, all pointing to the same year. This isn't a legend, it's real and still undeciphered. Are you ready? Hit like and subscribe, because what you're about to hear next will change how you see the future in the tapestry of American mysticism. One name continues to echo like a whisper from the shadows: Jean Dixon, a woman once hailed as the greatest psychic of the 20th century, revered, feared, and for some quietly dismissed, but hidden deep within her body of predictions, overshadowed by the glamour of presidential assassinations and global turmoil. There lies a forgotten prophecy, a warning she gave about a war. Jean Dixon, the forgotten American oracle. Not just any war, a war in 2025 between two great powers, and in the end, she claimed that China would prevail. This was not science fiction. This was written decades ago. Jean Dixon rose to prominence in mid-century America during a time when faith in the unseen was colliding head first with the age of reason. Her predictions were uncanny. She famously foresaw the assassination of President John F. Kennedy years before it occurred. She predicted Roosevelt would not survive his term, and she was right. She foresaw Truman's rise when he was still a nobody, and Churchill's fall when the world still believed him untouchable. Time and time again, her visions rattled the corridors of power. So how then did her diest warning about the year 2025 fade into obscurity? It was in her later works, My Life and Prophecies, that Jean Dixon turned her gaze to the far future. Unlike her more public forecasts, this was not for immediate headlines. This was for posterity. She wrote a year in which a major confrontation would emerge between two superpowers, one known for dominance and defiance, the other is for patience and precision. Though she didn't name them outright, her descriptions were hauntingly specific. One would burn out in hubris, the other would rise from the east and triumph. Today, many believe she was referring to Russia and China, a reversal of Cold War expectations, a shift in the axis of power. Dixon's prophecy did not predict a nuclear holocaust. She foresaw something more insidious: a conflict of ideologies, fought not just with weapons, but through economic attrition, digital warfare, and cultural upheaval. She envisioned a world splintered, alliances dissolving, former enemies shaking hands, and traditional powers. Western democracies are being outmaneuvered, not through force, but through strategy and time. I see a dragon rising, she wrote, not breathing fire, but weaving silk over steel, drawing the world inward. A poetic phrase, but to modern ears it's chilling. But perhaps the most shocking element of Dixon's 2025 prediction is not what she said, but what she left unsaid. There are entire pages in her notes that remain blacked out, redacted, removed, or possibly never published, sections marked only with a date and the phrase "too dark for now." What did she see that she couldn't bring herself to write? Mainstream historians scoff at her legacy. They reduce her to coincidences, or worse, accuse her of retrofitting. But what they rarely mention is how often Dixon was courted by politicians, military officials, even foreign leaders. Not to debunk her, but to ask her what comes next. And yet, despite her proven track record, her warnings about 2025 remained buried, ignored, forgotten. Why was it? Because they challenged the West's sense of superiority? Was it because the idea of a victorious China was simply too unthinkable for Americans at the time? Or was it something more? Did someone want them hidden? There's another twist in Dixon's story. In the final years of her life, she became increasingly reclusive. She claimed that visions had changed. They were no longer images of specific events like elections or disasters. They were sequences, dominoes, falling, systems collapsing. She often repeated one phrase to her inner circle: the beginning comes from the middle, and the end comes from the mirror. To this day, no one knows exactly what she meant, but in the wake of growing geopolitical instability, cyber attacks, pandemics, and artificial intelligence, some now look back at her cryptic words and shudder. In 2020, a new generation of researchers began rediscovering Dixon's later writings. They found marginalia notes written in the edges of her old books. One simply said, Watch the water routes in 2025, it won't start on land. Another, the West sleeps while the East waits. These were not mere musings, they were patterns, clues, and each one points to a singular question: what exactly did Jean Dixon see in the year 2025 up? Next, we'll step deeper into the shadows, where a 16th century French seer wrote of a great shaking in Europe and of a war that would leave millions without a home. For centuries, the name Nostradamus has lingered like smoke in the halls of history, a physician, an astrologer, a poet. But above all else, he was a prophet, a man who with ink and metaphor tried to warn the future from within the confines of the past. His quatrains, cryptic verses dense with allegory, have fascinated and tormented scholars for generations. Many claim they predicted everything from the rise of Napoleon to the horror of Hitler, but buried deep among the Nostradamus, Europe's war of shadows, thousands of lines, lies a reference few have dared to interpret. Until now, a vision of a war in Europe set in the year 2025, and this time the signs are already showing in one particular quatrain. Nostradamus wrote, "The great war shall begin in the west, blood will reign across wide lands, hunger, plague, and iron shall return when the earth trembles near the Black Sea." At first glance the lines read like poetic dread, but place them alongside recent headlines, and suddenly they seem less poetic and more prophetic. Since 2022, Europe has been in the grip of renewed geopolitical instability. The invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces fractured the fragile peace that had held since the Cold War. Thousands dead, millions displaced, and still the conflict grinds on. Energy prices have soared, economies have buckled, and as Europe arms itself, once again the world holds its breath. Is this the beginning that Nostradamus foresaw? Some scholars argue yes. They point to his reference to the Black Sea region, bordering Ukraine, Russia, and the volatile Balkans. They argue the phrase, iron shall return, isn't a metaphor. It's literal. Tanks, bombs, war. Others warned not to take the verses so literally. After all, Nostradamus never mentioned names, never listed years in the way we use them today, and yet the number 25 recurs in several interpretations of his work, not as a year, but as a turning point. One apocalyptic verse reads, 20 and 5 times shall the blood be spilt before the eagle bows to the bear. A strange riddle, but in the language of Cold War symbolism, it takes on a new tone. The eagle, often interpreted as America, the bear, Russia. Could Nostradamus have glimpsed a moment when Western powers falter and Eastern strength surges forward? But what truly haunts many researchers is not what Nostradamus predicted, but how eerily it aligns with others: Jean Dixon, Baba Vanga, even ancient Chinese seers, all pointing to 2025 as a year of rupture. It begs the question, did they all see the same storm from different corners of time? Critics dismiss this. They say Nostradamus was vague, ambiguous by design, that you can fit any modern event into his words if you try hard enough. But that dismissal, while logical, misses something deeper, a pattern, a mood. In nearly a dozen separate quatrains, Nostradamus refers to a great war, a shattered Europe, a cold sun and darkened skies, and a time of confusion between allies. These verses are spread across his prophecies, but when stitched together, a tapestry forms one that shows a continent not only at war with itself, but abandoned by those it once trusted. In one chilling passage, he writes, "The ally shall divide, the northern king betrayed, the lion will weep, and the bull's hall fall silent." Some interpret this as symbolic of NATO fracturing, or Britain, the lion, losing influence, and the bull, Spain, perhaps, or the financial markets. It's all interpretation, but it's getting harder to ignore how current these lines feel, especially when the very technologies reshaping modern warfare, AIG, guided drones, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, were inconceivable in Nostradamus' time, yet eerily echo his metaphors of silent weapons, phantoms in the air, and battles unseen. Is it a coincidence, pattern, recognition, or did he truly tap into something beyond logic? One school of thought suggests Nostradamus didn't see the future in detail, but sensed emotional signatures, waves of chaos, violence, upheaval. And if that's true, then the emotional resonance of Europe in 2025, tension, division, fear, may well be the same signal he was echoing. But there's a deeper concern. Nostradamus never described this war ending. Unlike other conflicts in his verses, this one lingers. Its consequences ripple through his later Predictions, famines, migrations, and climate disorder. In one dark stanza, he writes, "From the ashes of war the waters rise, new lands swallowed, old nations erased." This has led some to speculate that the war he saw in 2025 doesn't simply end battles. It ends eras, the age of Western dominance, of centralized power, of predictable geopolitics. Washed away, of course, none of this is proof, and Nostradamus is easy to misuse. But there is one detail that few talk about. In 1555, the same year, he published his first major book of prophecies. Nostradamus wrote a private letter to King Henry II of France. In it, he warned of a black season for the European continent, a time when the lights of the north shall dim and the cries of the old cities shall echo without answer. For centuries this passage meant little. But today, as Europe faces rising authoritarianism, refugee crises, economic strain, and war on its doorstep, some are beginning to wonder, what if the lights are already dimming? The war that Nostradamus predicted may not come in a single flash, no great trumpet, no single declaration. Instead, it may unfold slowly, quietly beneath our feet, until one day we look around and realize we are already living in it. So, Baba Vanga. The beginning of the end. The question becomes, will 2025 be the year Europe finally breaks? Or is it the year the world realizes it already has? Up next, we travel further east to a blind mystic from the Balkans, whose warnings about 2025 are perhaps the most terrifying yet. In a quiet village in the Balkans, far from the political thrones and military strongholds of the modern world, lived a blind woman. Her name was Vanalia Pandiva Gustarova, but the world would come to know her as Baba Vanga. She was no scholar, no astrologer, no author of cryptic poetry. She claimed no formal education, only that a powerful wind once lifted her from the earth, and when it set her down again, her eyes had gone dark. But her visions had begun. Her followers believed she could see what no one else could, and perhaps they were right, because among her many predictions, some strange, some eerily accurate, there was one that still lingers like smoke in the air, one that whispers its warning in the back of our collective mind. 2025, not just another year, not just another crisis. Baba Vanga called it the beginning of the end. She never claimed the world would end in fire or flood, not yet. But she said that in 2025 a chain reaction would begin, a cascade of disasters, political, environmental, social, that would unravel the fragile threads of modern civilization. And for some, that unraveling has already begun. According to those close to her, Baba Vanga spoke of a great war in Europe starting into or around 2025, a conflict that would leave cities and ruin, nations broken, and the population of the continent drastically reduced. She said the war would not come from a single cause, but from many competing for water, fighting over oil, ideologies clashing like tectonic plates. Some of her visions reportedly included images of ash-filled skies, rivers turned black, and mothers carrying lifeless children through silent streets, and always the same word whispered in the aftermath. Why? Skeptics point to the vagueness of her claims. They argue her predictions could apply to any time of tension, any era of conflict, and perhaps they're right, but that doesn't explain the timing. Why 2025? Why did Jean Dixon, Nostradamus, and now Baba Vanga all see that same year as a critical fracture point? Some believers say she didn't just see the war itself, she saw what followed in her final years. Vanga told her caretakers that after 2025 nothing would be the same. She spoke of the breakdown of communication of machines that would no longer respond to food that could no longer be eaten. She warned of a sickness not viral, but environmental. People would fall ill, she said, not from germs, but from the very air they breathe and the soil beneath their feet. Modern analysts interpret these statements as metaphors for pollution, climate collapse, and ecosystem failure. But others hear something deeper. They hear prophecy. Vanga's followers claim that many of her past visions came true. They cite her prediction of the Kursk submarine disaster, the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia, the rise of ISIS, and even the September 11th attacks. And though not all her prophecies are verifiable, the ones that cannot be ignored, but it's her apocalyptic foresight that disturbs even her staunchest defenders. She once said, "The cold will return, the hunger will spread, and mankind will forget how to be human." Chilling words, especially today, as parts of the world face extreme drought, while others drown in once-in-a-century floods, as governments grow more authoritarian, as civil discourse collapses into tribalism, And yet there was always a glimmer in her prophecies, a paradox, a duality. Vanga didn't believe the world would be destroyed completely. She claimed that humanity would survive, but only barely. In her words, there will be a time when people lived beneath the ground and others above the clouds. Some interpret this as a metaphor, others point to ongoing experiments in underground cities and the rise of elite sky towns and architectural planning circles in recent years. She has even been linked to a lesser-known claim that by 2025 the separation of rich and poor would no longer just be financial, but geographical. The wealthy would flee polluted cities and retreat to clean, sealed environments, while the rest would be left behind. A dystopia or a roadmap. She spoke often about the return of the silence, a period after 2025 where communication breaks down not because of war or censorship, but because people stop listening. She warned the division would no longer be just political, but spiritual, that entire culture would forget who they are in that silence. She said would come a moment of decision, not from leaders, not from armies, but from us, the choice to rebuild or fall further. It's important to note Baba Vanga's predictions were never recorded by her. They were shared secondhand through relatives, reporters, and believers, which means they could have been distorted, misinterpreted, or manipulated. But it's not just the accuracy that matters, it's the resonance. Why do her words still haunt us? Why do they feel more relevant with each passing year? Perhaps because deep down we know something is wrong, something fundamental, something broken. And perhaps that's what she saw, not just the fall of cities, but the erosion of compassion, not just environmental collapse, but moral fatigue. In a sense, her prophecy may not have been a prediction at all, but a warning, a whisper meant to be heard before the storm. And now the clouds are gathering. So we're left with a choice. Is 2025 truly the beginning of the man from 2062? Time travelers' warnings the end? Or is it just the last moment we have to turn back up? Next, we meet a man who didn't just warn us about 2025. He claimed to have lived through it. It began on a quiet night in November 2010, buried deep within the chaotic threads of Japan's two-channel forum, a massive anonymous message board known for unfiltered opinions and fringe theories. Someone posted a message that would shake the entire online community. The post wasn't angry, it wasn't political, it wasn't even particularly long. It was simply titled, "I am from the year 2062. Most users laughed another time. Traveler, they scoffed, just another role player trying to stir up attention, but this one felt different. The writer claimed he had traveled back in time on a classified mission, not to save the world, not to change history, but to observe, to gather data, to understand how a sequence of devastating events beginning in the 2010s spiraled the Earth toward irreversible collapse. He never said exactly why he had come. He never mentioned names, only warnings and one message that would haunt readers forever: escape to the mountains. At first, no one knew what to make of it. Some tried decoding it, wondering if it was a metaphor, a riddle, or simply nonsense. Others dismissed it entirely. But then on March 11th, 2011, everything changed. A magnitude 9.00 earthquake struck off Japan's northeastern coast, triggering a monstrous tsunami. Cities were destroyed, nuclear plants melted down, thousands died, and suddenly escape to the mountains didn't sound like nonsense anymore. It sounded like a prophecy. The post from the so-called man from 2062 was quickly unearthed by users. Screenshots circulated. People began to ask, had someone actually tried to warn us? And then he vanished for months. There was silence until July 2011, when he returned. This time people were ready. They flooded him with questions. What would happen next? Could disaster be stopped? Was the future already written? But his answers were elusive, vague. He never gave direct predictions, except one. He said he would return again in April 2016 because he claimed another major event was on its way. Skepticism returned to form, moved on until April 2016 arrived, and with it, an earthquake, this time in Kumamoto Prefecture. It wasn't as massive as 2011, but it was enough to send chills through those who remembered the warning. And then he posted again. He said little, only that he would return on May 17th, 2016, and once more on May 16th, just one day before. Another earthquake struck Araki Prefecture. It was small, but the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a game anymore. People began taking him seriously. They archived every post. They created databases. They even tracked his sentence structure, looking for hidden codes. And as they dug deeper, a new pattern emerged. His warnings weren't just about natural disasters. He began to speak carefully about the years ahead, and what he described was Terrifying, according to the man from 2062, the decades following. 2020 would plunge humanity into a period of prolonged global conflict, not a single explosive world war, but a rolling storm of regional disputes, regime collapses, and proxy battles, eventually escalating into something far worse. He claimed that between 2025 and 2030, a large-scale global war would break out. But this war, it would not be fought with nuclear weapons, it would be waged with chemical agents, invisible poisons floating through the air, infecting the lungs, destroying DNA, turning entire cities into zones of silent death. He said that Japan, his home country, would be nearly annihilated, that entire nations would vanish from maps, and that only a few would survive hidden in isolated elevated places, hence the warning escape to the mountains. But even survival, he said, would not be peace. He spoke of a post-war world transformed beyond recognition. India, he claimed, would rise as the new global power, not just militarily, but technologically. Its population would explode to over 5.5 billion. And it would lead to a revolution in space-based energy harvesting power directly from satellites and eliminating dependence on oil or minerals. He spoke of underground cities built to shield survivors from toxic air and radiation, and of sky cities floating above the poison ground, reserved for the rich and powerful. He described humanity splitting in two, those who adapted and those who didn't. He said food would become dangerous, that seafood would vanish from diets, that alcohol would be lethal, and even a minor mistake in daily routine could cost lives. But he didn't stop there. He described a future where medicine fused with machines, where people implanted nanotech chips in their bodies capable of healing wounds, regulating emotion, even allowing telepathic communication within small distances. Language barriers would fade, borders would shift, and privacy would end. He called it a golden age of control, a world of order, but no freedom. He never said whether this future was inevitable. He never claimed to be a savior, but his tone was always the same, cold, precise, detached, as if he were simply reporting facts, as if he'd already watched it happen. Some Alois Erlmeyer. The war that begins in the dark. Believe he was a hoax, a brilliant storyteller with uncanny timing. But if that's true, why did he stop posting in 2016? Why no book deal, no podcast, no monetization? He vanished again, without a trace, just as he said he would, and yet his words remain escaped to the mountains now. As we stand on the threshold of 2025, a year marked by so many warnings, Dixon's, Nostradamus's, Vanga's, one question rises above the rest. Did the man from 2062 see something, or did he live it? And if so, why did he come back up? Next, we move to Germany, where a humble seer once described a war that would begin in the Balkans and end with skies full of yellow sand. He was no scholar, no priest, no scientist. Alois Meyer was a simple man, a well digger from Bavaria. Yet during the turbulent years following World War II, people came from miles around to speak with him, not for water, but for visions. They believed he could see what others could not. And in the quiet years before his death in 1959, Meyer left behind a prophecy, one that has haunted Germany ever since, a vision of a third world war, a war that would begin with chaos and end with yellow dust from the sky. What makes his vision so disturbing today is how specific it is. He described as sudden conflict starting in the Balkans. A politician was murdered. Riots are erupting across Europe, and then without warning, columns of Russian tanks pushed westward across Germany toward the Rhine. But that was only the beginning. According to Meyer, the attack will be swift, deadly, and completely unannounced. There will be no warning. He said it happens overnight while the world is distracted. He described skies darkened by aircraft, highways choked with refugees, and cities swallowed by panic. But then he spoke of something far worse, a weapon, one that doesn't explode but spreads. He called it yellow dust, a fine powder falling from the sky, killing everything it touches, animals, people, even plants, invisible, odorless, lethal. He claimed this dust would be dropped from high altitudes, carried by the wind, and that anyone caught outside would be dead within minutes. Modern interpretations suggest this could be a form of chemical or biological warfare, or perhaps a radioactive compound. But Immers insisted it wasn't a nuclear bomb. He specifically stated, the nuclear war will not come. The Great War is fought differently, and that's what terrifies modern analysts. For decades, the world has prepared for nuclear conflict, but Meyer describes something else, something quieter, crueler, harder to detect, and harder To survive, his vision didn't end with the dust. He foresaw great destruction across France and Italy, London burning, the Vatican in ruins, and Eastern armies reached deep into Central Europe before finally being pushed back. But at what cost? He described German cities as elevated fields, poisoned, millions dead, and 3 days of total darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, literal. No sun, no moon, no stars, he said. And during this time, he warned no one should step outside, and doors must be sealed, windows covered, because the air itself would kill it. A chilling vision made worse by its eerie parallels to modern warfare scenarios involving electromagnetic pulses, chemical agents, and climate engineer blackouts. At the time, people scoffed, but over the years, as his other visions proved strangely accurate, his predictions of the Berlin Wall, the Eurozone crisis, even the refugee waves of the 2010s, his war prophecy began to feel less like folklore and more like a warning. Even more disturbing is his claim that the war would be engineered. He said it would not start because of the hatred between people, but because men behind curtains desired it, that shadowy elites would provoke a conflict not for conquest, but for reset control, a new order born from manufactured chaos. He claimed that this war would not last long, just a few weeks, but its scars would last for generations. He even described the aftermath as strange peace. Europe drastically changed, borders redrawn, governments replaced, and most haunting of all, a new religious figure rising from the ashes. He called him the Golden One, not because of wealth, but because of the light. Some believe he meant a spiritual leader, others think it was symbolic. But one thing is clear in the Tang monk. The 13th verse and the rise of the center mirrors vision. The war doesn't end with death, it ends with something new. But the question remains, was Alois Meyer truly seeing the future, or simply echoing the trauma of the wars he lived through? After all, he was not a prophet. By training, he never wrote books, never sought fame. He even tried to avoid attention, saying his visions came uninvited, that they haunted him. And yet he described technologies he shouldn't have known about. He spoke of metal birds without wings, of lightning-fast machines that traveled silently, of people communicating without voices through boxes, descriptions that sound eerily like drones, missiles, and smartphones. He even predicted the rise of China as a global power. He said, "While the West sleeps, the Yellow One prepares." This phrase has been debated endlessly. Is it racist, symbolic, literal? We may never know. But in the context of modern geopolitics, it rings with unsettling clarity. And perhaps most hauntingly, Mimir said that after the dust, the survivors would change, not just physically, but mentally, that people would become different, less trusting, less human. He claimed many would abandon cities, live in small, isolated communities, and that for a long time, no child would laugh. It's hard to know what to make of these words. They sound like poetry, but they feel like prophecy, because when we look at the trajectory of global events, pandemics, economic collapse, climate disasters, rising extremism, AI disruption, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where one spark ignites the world. Errol Meyer believed that the spark would come from the Balkans, and that once it began, nothing could stop it. So we're left with one final question. Is this merely the fever dream of an old man, or is it the most detailed war prophecy ever recorded? Coming up next, we travel further east. In ancient China, a monk from the Tang dynasty left behind a series of poems, 12 of which have come true, and the 13th speaks of a serpent year. In the center of the world, in the golden age of China's Tang dynasty, amid poets, philosophers, and emperors, there lived a monk. His name is lost to time, but the verses he left behind have not been forgotten, buried in dusty temple archives. For centuries, the monk's manuscript was known only by its title, 13 verses of fate. Each poem, no more than a few lines, written in ancient Chinese, dense with metaphor, but chilling in their accuracy. 12 of those verses, historians now believe, have already come true, and the 13th, it points to the year 2025. The first known reference to these prophecies came during the Song dynasty, when imperial scholars uncovered the manuscript in a crumbling monastery in western China. They were disturbed by what they read, not just because of the content, but because some verses seemed to describe events that hadn't yet occurred. One verse, for example, is believed to predict the Mongol invasion, another the fall of the Ming dynasty, yet another the Opium Wars, describing foreign ships breathing fire, bringing flowers of sleep. But it wasn't until the 20th century that serious attention was paid to the monk's final verse. It reads, "In the year of the serpent, the world shall tilt to the center, smoke from the heavens, and men who forget the stars. Ancient Chinese astrology places 2025 as a year of the wood snake. And if the verse is to be taken literally, it suggests a massive geopolitical shift, one that brings the world attention or power back to the center. But what is the center? Some scholars believe it refers to China, known traditionally as Jiango, the Middle Kingdom. Others interpret it as a spiritual concept, a loss of moral or philosophical balance. But one thing is certain: the timing is unnerving, because once again we find a prophecy pointing directly to 2025. The verse also speaks of smoke from the heavens in the monk's time. Such language could have meant divine punishment, but in today's world it evokes other images: missiles streaking across the sky, satellites falling, even atmospheric pollution from war or disaster. And then comes the most cryptic line: men who forget the stars. Ancient Chinese culture revered the stars as guides for travel, time, and fate. To forget them implies not just technological overreach, but spiritual blindness, a world that has lost its way. Some interpret this line as a warning against over-reliance on machines, on artificial intelligence, on systems so complex, so disconnected from conclusion, the rhythms of nature, that humanity itself becomes unmed. There's another theory, one far more disturbing, that men who forget the stars refers not to forgetfulness, but to being cut off, as in a technological collapse, satellites down, navigation lost, communication gone, a return to darkness, not of ignorance, but of silence. A few researchers have gone further. They argue that the tilting described in the verse is literal, an axis shift, a change in the Earth's magnetic poles, or perhaps a metaphor for power, because by 2025, China is set to eclipse the United States in multiple key metrics: GDP, military projection, and AI development. Could this verse be describing the moment when the world no longer answers to the West, but the real mystery lies not just in the words, but in the silence around them? Because the Tang monk who wrote these prophecies, according to legend, vanished. No one knows his name. No record exists of his birth or death, and his manuscript ends abruptly, as if he wrote the 13th verse and then disappeared. There are whispers in some circles that the monk was not just a prophet, but a time traveler, a soul who moved between cycles of civilization, a guardian of forgotten warnings. It sounds like fantasy, and maybe it is, but the fact remains: 12 of his 13 verses have eerily mirrored real events, and the 13th has yet to unfold. There's one more layer to this story, one that connects the monk to another great Chinese mystery, the 2bi. 2, sometimes called the Chinese Nostradamus. The 2bi is a book of 60 illustrated prophecies, each paired with cryptic poems banned at various points in history. It has long been studied in secret. The 56th prophecy speaks of a man with iron eyes and children with no tongues. The east rises, and the west watches in silence. Again, the year unknown. But many believe the final prophecies of 2abu and the monk of Tang overlap, both culminating in the mid-2020 essay, both predicting war, silence, and a global shift in power. It's easy to dismiss these as a coincidence, ancient texts warped by modern fears. But when so many threads point to the same year, the same region, the same themes, should we really ignore them? The monk's prophecy ends with a warning written in the margin by a later scribe: "This is the last. Should the center rise without balance, the wheel shall turn against the sky." A cryptic image, but perhaps it means this: if power rises too quickly, without wisdom, without harmony, then what was meant to bring order may instead bring ruin. So now we must ask, what happens if 2025 truly is the year the world tilts? Are we ready for the center to rise? And if not, who will be there to stop it? Because history isn't just written by those who win, it's remembered by those who survive. 6 prophecies, 6 voices, 6 warnings, all converging on a single year, from the halls of ancient Chinese monasteries to the foggy streets of post-war Germany, from French quatrains and Balkan visions to digital whispers on forgotten internet forums. Each speaks of chaos, of war, of silence, and most disturbingly, they all point to 2025. But how could seers separated by centuries, cultures, and beliefs all fixate on the same moment? Coincidence, mass projection, or something else? Some say it's pattern-seeking madness, that we only see what we want to see, but others sense a deeper thread, that reality itself, like a river, sometimes sends ripples backwards through time, and a few rare souls hear them still. One truth remains unshakable despite all our science, all our certainty. We still do not understand time or fate or why some warnings survive while others are buried. So now we're left with a choice to dismiss these voices as relics of fear and myth, or to pause and wonder what if they were right. Because if 2025 truly is the turning point, then the future is not just unwritten, it is unstable. So we ask you now, what do you believe? Which prophecy chilled you the most? What theory makes the most sense to you, or the least? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes the answers don't come from history, they come from those brave enough to question it. And if you haven't already subscribed, because the next mystery may already be written in the stars or in the dust of a forgotten page.